The dust of the road had settled into the fine lines of her knuckles, a map of grit and distance drawn on her skin, and she pushed the ring across the counter with the last of her strength. It was a small thing, a thin band of gold with a single pearl, worn smooth and luminous from a lifetime of touch, and it made no sound as it slid over the gouged surface of the wood, coming to rest in the dry, disinterested light of the trading post. The man behind the counter, a man whose face was a collection of hard angles and small calculations, picked it up without ceremony, holding it between a thumb and forefinger, as if weighing not its gold, but its desperation. He did not look at her. He looked at the ring, then through it, at the profit it represented, a silent and immediate conversion of sentiment into currency. She watched his eyes, the flat, placid surface of them, and saw nothing of her own history reflected there, no sense of the life that had been lived with that ring on a finger, no echo of the love it was meant to signify. It was just an object now, an offering. He grunted, a sound of grudging acceptance, and turned away, his back a broad wall of indifference as he reached for the rifle on the wall behind him. It was an old weapon, the stock scarred and dark with oil, the barrel a dull, unpolished gray, a tool made for endings. He set it on the counter with a heavy finality, a sound that filled the small, cluttered room and seemed to suck the air from her lungs. The exchange was complete, a memory for a means, a past for a future. She reached for the rifle, her fingers curling around the cold, unfamiliar weight of the wood and steel, and she did not look back at the small gleam of gold on the counter as she turned and walked out into the unforgiving glare of the sun. She did not let herself. The land stretched out under a white, hammered sky, each rise and fall of the earth baked into a uniform hardness that offered no comfort and no quarter. For 3 days, she walked, and the rifle became a part of her, an alien appendage of weight and purpose that she shifted from shoulder to shoulder as the sun beat down on the crown of her head. The world had become a simple, brutal equation of thirst and distance, of the horizon that never seemed to get closer, and the sun that never seemed to move. Her own name felt like a word from a different language, a life lived by someone else, and all that remained was the forward motion, the rasp of her own breathing, and the heavy, solid presence of the rifle against her back. It was on the 3rd day, when the light began to fail and the shadows of the sagebrush grew long and skeletal, that she saw it, not a town or a settlement, but a single, solitary ranch house, nestled in a shallow basin where the land held a little more green. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a fragile signal of life in the vast, empty quiet. It was a place of order, in a world of chaos. The straight lines of its fences, a rebuke to the ragged wilderness around it. She stumbled toward it, drawn by that plume of smoke as a dying moth is drawn to a flame, and she did not know if it meant salvation or simply a different kind of end. She reached the well, a circle of dark, mossy stone, and the rope for the bucket felt impossibly heavy in her hands, her muscles screaming with a weakness that was deeper than simple fatigue. She managed to draw water, her hands shaking so badly that half of it sloshed over the side, and she drank, the cold shock of it, a sudden, violent mercy. Then the world tilted and went dark at the edges. She collapsed. He found her there, a small, discarded heap of dusty fabric and exhaustion beside his well, the rifle lying in the dirt beside her. Silas had seen his share of strays, both four-legged and two, and his first instinct was always the same, a deep and abiding caution that had been carved into him by years of solitude and the hard lessons of the land. He stood over her for a long moment, his shadow falling across her still form, and his eyes took in the details with a practiced economy. The worn-out boots, the patched dress, the thinness of her wrists, and the rifle. It was the rifle that gave him pause. It was an old plainsman model, solid and reliable, but it didn't fit her. It looked like a borrowed thing, a tool she did not know how to use. He saw the faint gleam of something near her hand, half buried in the dust, and knelt down, his knees cracking in the silence. It was a spent shell casing. He picked it up, rolled it in his palm. She had fired the weapon. At what, he could not guess. He looked from the casing to her face, which was pale and streaked with dirt, her hair a tangled mess clinging to her temples. She was young, younger than he had first thought, and there was a vulnerability in the slackness of her unconscious features that went deeper than her obvious exhaustion. He could have left her there. He could have nudged her awake, given her a canteen of water, and pointed her down the road. It would have been the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But his gaze fell on her hands again, the knuckles raw and scraped, the nails broken, the hands of someone who had been holding on to something for a very long time and had finally let go. He would spend a long time afterward wondering what it was in that moment that made the choice for him. What quiet imperative moved through him, but he did not wonder then. He simply acted. He slid one arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her to the barn. Afternoon. The light inside the barn was thick and golden, cut into solid shafts by the gaps in the plank walls, and the air smelled of hay and leather and the warm animal scent of the horse in the far stall. She woke slowly, the world returning to her, not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual layering of sensations. The scratch of a wool blanket against her cheek, the distant rhythmic stamp of a hoof on packed earth, the low murmur of a man's voice, not speaking to her, but to the horse. She sat up, her head swimming, and saw him across the wide, dusty space. He was currying the horse, his movements slow and methodical, the brush moving in long, sure strokes that spoke of a deep and practiced familiarity. He was a tall man, lean, but broad in the shoulders, and he moved with a kind of quiet economy, no wasted motion, no hurried gestures. He did not seem to have noticed she was awake, or if he had, he gave no sign. A tin plate of food and a cup of water sat on a crate beside the pile of hay where she had been sleeping. It was simple fare, a piece of bread and some dried meat. But to her, it looked like a feast. She ate, her hunger a raw, painful ache in her stomach, and drank the water, and all the while she watched him. He finished with the horse and moved to a workbench against the far wall, where he began to mend a piece of tack, his hands working the leather and thread with the same unhurried competence. The silence stretched between them, not awkward or tense, but solid, like the thick wooden beams above their heads. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she had come from or where she was going. He simply allowed her the space to exist, to breathe, to be. It was a kind of courtesy she had not known in a very long time, and it was more disarming than any question. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, roughened by disuse. The rifle's on the porch. He did not look at her when he said it, his attention still fixed on the needle he was pushing through the thick leather. It's cleaned. She said nothing, only nodded, though he could not see it. The gesture was for herself, a small acknowledgement, a beginning. That night, she slept in the barn again, and the next day, she found a rhythm. She did not ask if she could stay, and he did not tell her to leave. An unspoken arrangement fell into place, a silent contract written in the language of shared work. She mucked out the stalls and filled the water troughs, her movements clumsy at first, then more certain as she learned the weight and feel of the tools. He mended the fences that bordered his property, his figure a distant, solitary shape against the horizon for most of the day. They ate their meals separately, she on the porch steps, he at his table inside the small house, but the food came from the same pot. In the afternoons, when the heat was at its most oppressive, she would take the rifle. She would walk out to the far edge of the property, where a line of tin cans sat on a fence post, and she would practice. The rifle was heavy, the kick of it a brutal, jarring shock that bruised her shoulder and rattled her teeth. Her shots went wide, kicking up dust far to the left or right of the targets, the sharp crack of the report echoing in the vast silence. A lonely and futile sound. She knew he was aware of her practice. Sometimes, from the corner of her eye, she would see him pause in his work. His head tilted slightly as the sound reached him, but he never said a word. He never offered to help, and she never asked. It was her own struggle, her own private war with the unwieldy piece of steel and wood, and she had to learn to master it on her own terms. The rifle was the reason she was here. It was the price of her freedom, and she was determined to make it worth the cost. Each missed shot was a fresh reminder of the ring, of the smooth, familiar feel of it, of the woman who had worn it. Each failure was a whisper that she had made a bad trade. So she kept shooting, day after day, until her shoulder was a permanent, mottled bruise, and the smell of gunpowder clung to her clothes and her hair. She kept shooting because she did not know what else to do. Days later, they came. There were two of them on horseback, their shapes dark and sharp against the bright, empty sky as they rode up the long track to the house. They moved with an easy, proprietary air, as if the land already belonged to them. Silas saw them coming from a long way off, and stood on his porch, his posture relaxed but his hands still, waiting. He had taken off his work gloves, and his hands hung loose at his sides, the knuckles scarred, the palms calloused, hands that knew how to hold on and how to let go. Alara, who had been cleaning the water pump, froze when she saw them, her body going rigid. A sudden, animal stillness falling over her. She recognized the man in the lead, Brody. He was the man from the trading post, but he looked different out here, under the open sky, more substantial, more dangerous. His companion was a younger man with a mean, restless set of eyes that darted around the ranch, taking inventory, assessing value. Brody reined in his horse a few feet from the porch, his gaze sweeping over the house, the barn, the well-tended fences, a flicker of something like professional appreciation in his eyes. Then his eyes landed on Alara, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. It was a smile of ownership, of casual possession. "Well, look what we have here," Brody said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet air. He did not address Silas. He spoke as if the rancher were merely another feature of the landscape. "Lost your way, little bird." Alara said nothing, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of the pump. She stared at a point somewhere past his shoulder, refusing to meet his eyes. Brody's smile widened. He enjoyed her fear. It was part of the transaction. He finally turned his attention to Silas, his gaze dismissive. "She working for you, rancher?" The question was an accusation, a challenge wrapped in a thin veneer of civility. Silas did not move. His eyes, the color of a washed-out sky, met Brody's, and for a long moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the dry grass. "She is," Silas said, his voice flat and even, a simple statement of fact that carried an unexpected weight. It was a line drawn in the dust. Brody's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected a different answer. He had expected deference, or perhaps a hasty denial. This quiet, unyielding solidity was something he hadn't factored into his calculations. He looked back at Alara, then at the rifle leaning against the porch wall beside Silas. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Still got the rifle, I see. Got it for a song. Traded a pretty little ring for it. Pearl on it." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, a small, cruel demonstration of his power, of what he knew. Seemed like a poor trade at the time, still does. He tipped his hat to Silas, a gesture of mocking politeness. "Just checking on my neighbors." He turned his horse and rode away, his hired man falling in behind him, and they did not look back. The dust settled behind them. Alara finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body trembling. Silas remained on the porch, his eyes fixed on the spot where they had disappeared over the rise. The quiet had returned, but it was different now. It was heavier. It was filled with a threat that had been given a name and a face. That evening, the air grew thick and heavy, the sky turning a bruised purple at the edges as a storm gathered in the distance. Silas found her by the fence line, staring out at the darkening land. He carried the rifle in one hand, and another, smaller one in the other. He said nothing, simply held out the smaller rifle to her. It was a .22, lighter, with less kick. She looked at it, then at him, a question in her eyes. "Start with this one," he said. "Learn to breathe, learn to squeeze, not pull, learn to see." It was the most he had said to her at one time since she had arrived. He spent the next hour with her, in the failing light, his instruction as sparse and direct as his speech. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to align the sights. He never touched her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the quiet certainty of his presence, a steadying force. He corrected her posture with a word, a nod of his head. "Don't fight it," he told her, his voice low. "Become part of it. The rifle, your arm, your eye, one thing." She listened. She did what he said. And for the first time, she hit the can. The small ping of the bullet striking metal was a startlingly loud and satisfying sound in the immense quiet. A small victory. A tiny spark of hope. They continued like this for days, the lessons becoming a part of their daily rhythm. As regular as sunrise and sunset, he taught her to read the wind, to account for the drop of the bullet over distance, to control the frantic beating of her own heart. She was a quick study, her focus absolute, her determination a fierce, quiet fire. The fear that had driven her to his ranch began to transform, hardening into something else, something more useful. Resolve. The rifle no longer felt like an alien object in her hands. It felt like a tool. And in the quiet moments between shots, a strange and fragile trust began to grow between them, built not on words or confessions, but on the shared space of a common purpose. He was giving her a skill, a means of defense, but it was more than that. He was giving her back a piece of herself. He was teaching her that she was not helpless. The small cruelties began a week later. A section of fence cut in the night, his small herd of cattle scattered across the open range, a day's hard work to round them up again. A dead coyote dropped into his well, poisoning the water and forcing him to spend 2 days cleaning it out. hauling bucket after bucket of fouled water until his back ached with a fire that matched the one in his gut. There was no proof it was Brody, of course. There never was. These were the actions of a man who understood power not as open confrontation, but as a slow, corrosive pressure. A campaign of attrition designed to make his life difficult, to make him understand the cost of defiance. The men in the nearby town of Redemption watched it happen. They saw Silas ride in for supplies, his face grimmer, his silence deeper. They heard the whispers, the rumors of the girl he was sheltering. They knew Brody, and they knew his methods. But they said nothing. Their silence was a form of complicity, a collective decision not to get involved, not to attract the same kind of trouble to their own doorsteps. They were good men, most of them, but their goodness had its limits, and those limits stopped at the edge of their own property. Silas felt their eyes on him as he loaded sacks of flour and salt into his wagon. He saw their gazes slide away when he met them. He was on his own. He had always been on his own, but now the solitude felt different. It was no longer a choice, but a condition imposed upon him. One afternoon, as he was repairing the cut fence line, his shirt off in the blistering heat, Alara brought him a canteen of water. She saw the scar then, a puckered, ugly white line that ran from his elbow down his forearm, a scar that could only have come from a knife, and a long time ago. She did not ask about it. She simply handed him the water, her eyes meeting his for a second longer than usual. In that look, an understanding passed between them. They were both survivors of a past they did not speak of. They both carried scars, his on his skin, hers on the inside. He took the canteen, his calloused fingers brushing against hers, and drank deeply. "They'll be back," she said, her voice quiet but steady. It wasn't a question. "I know," he said. He finished the water and handed the canteen back to her. He picked up his tools and went back to work, his movements as deliberate and unhurried as ever. The sun beat down. The fence needed mending. The world kept turning. They came at dawn. Brody, his hired man, and a third man. This one wearing a tarnished badge that marked him as the town's part-time lawman, a man whose loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder. They did not ride up to the house this time but stopped at the gate, a formal, almost legalistic distance. Silas was already on the porch, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. He had been expecting them. Alara stood in the doorway behind him, a silent shadow. The rifle, her rifle, was in her hands, held loosely, but ready. Brody smiled that same cold, transactional smile. He held up a piece of paper. "Got a warrant here, rancher, for a runaway. An indentured girl from back east. Name of Alara Vance." The name fell into the morning air, and Alara flinched as if struck. It had been so long since she had heard it spoken aloud. "Contracts held by a concern I do business with," Brody continued, his voice smooth and reasonable. "They've authorized me to retrieve their property." He looked past Silas, directly at Alara. "It's just business. No need for anyone to get hurt." He paused. Then his eyes glinted with a fresh cruelty. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the ring. It caught the morning sun, the pearl glowing with a soft, captured light. He held it out on the palm of his hand. "This is what she was worth when she bought that rifle. A pittance. Tell you what, I'll give you double what it's worth, for your trouble, and we'll call the whole thing square." It was the ultimate insult. The final reduction of a human life to a simple, ugly number. He was not just trying to take her, he was trying to erase her, to make her nothing more than an object to be bought and sold. Silas looked at the ring in Brody's hand. He looked at the smug certainty on Brody's face. Then he looked back at Alara, at the terror in her eyes, but also at the fierce, defiant way she held the rifle, her knuckles white. He saw not a piece of property, not an indentured servant, but a person who had fought her way here, who had earned her place. He saw a resilience he had come to admire. He turned his gaze back to Brody, and his voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "That ring isn't yours to sell." Brody's smile faltered. He had expected fear or negotiation. Not this. Not this absolute refusal to play the game by his rules. "That's my final offer, rancher." "It's not an offer," Silas said. "It's an insult." The man with the badge shifted uneasily, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. The air grew tight, stretched thin, ready to snap. This was the moment, the point where everything that had been building for weeks would finally break, one way or another. It was then that Alara moved. She stepped out from the doorway, moving past Silas to stand at the edge of the porch. She was trembling, but her eyes were clear. She did not raise the rifle toward the men. She raised it toward the fence line, 100 yards away, where a single, solitary tin can sat on a post, the same one she had missed 1,000 times. The world seemed to hold its breath. She breathed out, just as Silas had taught her. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot was sharp and clean, and an instant later, the tin can jumped into the air, spinning end over end before falling into the dust. A perfect shot. It was not a threat. It was a statement, a declaration of competence, of presence, of a will that would not be broken. It said, "I am not who you think I am. I am not helpless, not anymore." The silence that followed the shot was profound. Brody stared at the spot where the can had been. Then his eyes moved to the rifle in Alara's hands, and finally to her face. He saw something there he had not seen before, something that had not been for sale in his trading post. It was a look of absolute, unshakable resolve. His calculations began to shift. The equation was no longer simple. A terrified, fleeing girl was one thing, a piece of property to be reclaimed. A woman who could shoot like that, standing next to a man who would not bend, was something else entirely. She was a complication, a risk, an expense he had not anticipated. His business was built on preying on the weak, on transactions where the odds were stacked impossibly in his favor. There was no profit in a fair fight. There was only cost. He looked at Silas, at the man's unyielding stillness, and he knew he had misjudged him. He had mistaken quiet for weakness. He had mistaken solitude for vulnerability. It was a mistake he would not make again. He slowly lowered the hand holding the ring, the cruel theater of his offer collapsing into a petty, meaningless gesture. He curled his fingers over the gold band, hiding it from view. "This ain't over," he snarled, the words empty, a hollow echo of the power he had thought he possessed moments before. But it was over. Everyone there knew it. He had lost control of the narrative. He had lost the leverage of fear. He wheeled his horse around sharply, a gesture of frustration and fury, and spurred it back down the track, the lawman and his hired hand scrambling to follow. They rode away, not with the swaggering confidence of their arrival, but with the sullen haste of defeat. They did not look back. Alara lowered the rifle, her arms shaking now with the release of tension. Silas turned to her, and for the first time, he let a small, slow smile touch the corners of his mouth. It was a smile of profound respect. He had given her the tools, but she had forged the weapon herself. He simply nodded at her, a gesture that contained everything that did not need to be said. "Thank you. I am proud of you. You are safe." That afternoon, Silas rode into town alone. He was gone for several hours, and Alara watched the road, a new and unfamiliar anxiety knotting in her stomach. The victory of the morning felt fragile, temporary. She cleaned the rifle until it shone, her hands moving with a new and certain grace, the actions a calming ritual. She fed the horses, patched a tear in a grain sack, her mind busy with the small, necessary tasks of the day. But a part of her was listening, waiting for the sound of hoofbeats on the road. The sun was low in the sky, casting long golden fingers of light across the ranch. When he finally returned, he rode straight to the barn, dismounted, and began to unsaddle his horse without a word. She came out of the house and stood by the corral fence, watching him. He worked with his back to her, his movements methodical, deliberate, the same as always. Yet she could feel a change in him, a settling, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. When he was finished with the horse, he turned to face her. He walked over to the fence, his boots scuffing softly in the dust. He stopped in front of her, the wooden rails of the fence the only thing between them. He looked at her, his gaze direct and steady, and she saw in his eyes a deep and weary kindness, the kindness of a man who understood the true cost of things. He said nothing. He simply reached into his shirt pocket and then held out his closed fist. He opened his hand. Lying on his calloused, scarred palm was the ring, the small gold band, the single, luminous pearl. It seemed to pulse with a soft light in the twilight, a small, perfect circle of memory and hope. She stared at it, her throat tight, a hot rush of tears blurring her vision. She did not know what he had traded for it, what piece of himself he had sold to get it back. A prize bull, a parcel of land, a promise. It did not matter. The price was of no consequence. All that mattered was the act itself. It was an act of restoration, an act of profound and quiet grace. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers, no longer soft, but strong and capable, closing over the ring. She picked it up. It felt warm from his skin. It felt like coming home. Weeks later, a quiet peace had settled over the ranch. The kind of peace that is not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of a deep and settled rightness. The fences were mended, the well water was sweet and clear, the rhythm of the days was dictated by the sun and the seasons, a slow and steady heartbeat. Alara sat on the porch steps, the late afternoon sun warm on her back, a piece of leather in her lap. She was restitching a stirrup, her hands moving with a patient, practiced skill, the needle flashing in the light. The ring was on a thin leather cord around her neck, tucked beneath her shirt, where it rested against her skin, a small, private warmth. It was no longer a symbol of a past she had been forced to leave behind, but a quiet reminder of the future she was building, stitch by stitch. The rifle, the one she had bought with it, leaned against the wall inside the door, cleaned and oiled, a tool among other tools. It was a part of her story, a necessary chapter, but it was not the end of the story. Silas stood at the edge of the porch, looking out at the vast expanse of his land, at the way the light turned the distant hills to gold. He was a man who had built a fortress of solitude around himself, not to keep the world out, but to protect what little he had left. And now, that fortress had a second occupant. Her presence had not breached his walls. It had simply made them into a home. They rarely spoke of what had passed, of Brody, or the confrontation at the gate. There was no need. The understanding between them ran deeper than words, a silent current of shared experience and mutual respect. He had seen her strength, and she had seen his goodness. It was enough. He would spend a long time wondering about the quiet woman who had collapsed by his well, the woman who had traded her last beautiful thing for a chance at survival. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that in saving her, he had also, in some small but essential way, saved himself. He had bought back more than just a ring. He had bought back a piece of his own faith in the world. And as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of fire and rose, the two of them stood in the quiet twilight, two solitary figures who were no longer alone, guardians of a small, hard-won peace at the edge of the known world. Sometimes, the value of a thing is not what it costs, but what it represents. A ring can be more than gold and pearl. It can be a promise, a history, a last link to a life you thought you'd lost. And a rifle can be more than wood and steel. It can be a desperate choice, a line in the sand, a declaration that your life is your own. We all have things we hold dear, things whose worth can't be measured in dollars and cents. And we all face moments where we must decide what we are willing to trade to protect what matters most. The world will try to tell you what you are worth. It will try to put a price on your dignity, on your future. But true worth is never given. It is claimed. It is forged in the fires of hard choices and defended with quiet courage. It is the thing inside you that cannot be bought or sold. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening to this story. If it moved you, we hope you'll consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. And for more stories about the quiet strength that lives in us all, we hope you'll join our community. What is the one thing you have that is priceless to you? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, be well and take care of one another.